and specifically so nationalism is one of the most defining influences in the history of the world from the 1860s until the 1940s. And it is a huge movement that really kind of spontaneously, but also very deliberately erupts around the world in the 19th century, the 1800s. Different countries manifest nationalism in different ways. Some do so by separating themselves out and distinguishing themselves, such as Canada and Australia, no longer wanting to just be colonies of Great Britain, but rather wanting to be sort of federated states within the British Commonwealth. Parts of the Ottoman Empire break off because they're not Muslim or Turkish. But then in other places, parts of the world that had been very fragmented and disjointed unite together under one sort of national banner. And so there's not Okay, technical difficulties. That seems to be the theme of today. Sorry, I just did a whole bunch of talking and you didn't hear any of it. So, nationalism is this worldwide movement that is throughout the 1800s, particularly from the 1860s to the 1880s. And it manifests itself in different ways in different parts of the world. So, in some cases, people are separating out from a larger empire, such as Romania, Bulgaria, the Catholic areas of the Balkans, separating out from the Ottoman Empire as a real separation, right? In some cases, it's a distinction, like Australia and Canada. They're not sort of non-British because they're actually still part of the British Commonwealth and still consider Queen Elizabeth II their queen. But they distinguish themselves as we are not just Great Britain, we are Canada, we are Australia, we are separate countries. And then in some parts of the world, particularly in Germany and Italy, places that had been fragmented for centuries come together under a modern nation state. And John Green makes the case in video 34 of Crash Course World History that the American Civil War, which takes place right in the middle of this time period, the 1860s, is actually the birth of America as a modern nation state. So he would say that Lincoln, more than preserving the Union, really created the Union through the American Civil War, because afterwards we have a nation called the United States of America, whereas before we had more of a union of states called these United States of America in the plural. And I think he's got some validity to his point there, although I kind of fall into a middle ground within that particular debate. So we have a lot of ground to cover and not a whole lot of time to cover it. So let's try to plunge right in. So nationalism we have to start with some definitions. So what is a nation state? So nationalism is all about the creation of the modern nation state and the movement that gave birth to the modern nation state, as opposed to a clan, a tribe, an empire, a city-state, a confederation, an alliance, a league, all these other different political affiliations or that are possible. There's a distinction to be made with the modern nation state. And so we ask the question of what is a nation state? Well, John Green's definition that he gives in the Crash Course video is that a nation state involves a centralized government that can claim and exercise authority over a distinctive territory. It also involves a certain degree of linguistic and cultural homogeneity. Now, this is a little bit problematic because Canada is a nation state, but Quebec speaks French, which may explain why there's sort of a tension there, and the Quebecers have several times pressed for or been on the verge of declaring independence from Canada. So it's a little bit tricky what role linguistic and cultural homogeneity plays in this nation, right? If you Google it, the Google definition is a sovereign state whose citizens or subjects are relatively homogeneous in factors such as language or common descent. Excuse me, I've got my phone on again. All right, and then the Merriam-Webster's definition is a form of political organization under which a relatively homogeneous people inhabits a sovereign state, especially a state containing one as opposed to several nationalities. So this is the definition of a modern nation state. You see the sort of political unity, right? There has to be a centralized government that exercises control over the whole. Now, what level of control? At what point do you cross from being a confederation like the Tokugawa shogunate or the pre-Civil War United States, which wasn't really a confederation because you had the Articles of Confederation before the Constitution. So union of states versus nation state also becomes a little bit of a problematic technical definition. And then this whole idea of homogeneous culture and language. Can you have a nation state that is not homogeneous, that has a variety of nationalities and languages and cultures within it? These are some of the things that we're gonna wrestle with at the end of the class today. But these are important questions for us to consider. We also need to consider, as part of this lesson, what role public schools play in the shaping of a nation. John Green talks about public schools. It's not a coincidence that it's during this time period, starting really in the 1840s, but really blossoming after the Civil War in the 1860s and 70s and 80s, that the American public school movement really takes fire. And here you see a picture of a public school. 1894 is the date on this particular public school. What is public education? What role does it play? Well, it benefits the society by having an educated populace, but it also helps to create a nation by having a nationalizing project. In other words, socialization. In other words, who are we? What is our identity? What are our values? What are the things we consider to be important or not important? And this is why battles over public schools and over the curriculum used in public schools, for example, you saw John Green in the video make reference to the Texas public schools, because Texas adopts a common curriculum for all of their public schools, and because they're one of the largest states in America, they have huge influence over the direction that your major textbook publishers go in terms of how they shape curriculum. And Texas is very much wanting a unified culture, a unified nationality, a unified story of us as a people. And there are critics who say that's horrible. We can't have that. We need to, celebrate diversity, and you can't have this unifying whitewashing, as John Green called it, right? So what do public schools do? Well, public schools do very much shape, but are also shaped by the national consciousness. So public schools both create a public and are created by a public. And one of the questions we have in America is, do we have a public anymore for public schools? Do we have a culture? Do we have a nationality? Do we have an identity that we can invest in our public schools, that all of us as Americans would say, yes, that's who I am, and yes, that's what I believe in, and yes, that's what I want to have my children learn as our heritage? So that's a real question, and something that is highly controversial and divisive. But John Green is right in saying that public schools do not primarily serve the interests of the parents who put their kids in the schools, nor of the students who go to the schools. The primary ones who are served by public schools are the community or the society, which is a nebulous concept. But public schools are serving a purpose in creating citizens for a society, which is controversial in and of itself, but I think it's right. I think that's pretty much what they do. All right, so let's get down to some more definitions. And in our definitions, we're going to be looking at the difference between a nation, which is a group of people that have some things in common, usually a common language, common cultural heritage. And so you can have a nation where you don't really have a nation state, and you can talk about a people. So, for example, historians like to talk about Germany, and they'll talk about Germany before there is a modern nation state of Germany in 1871. Because there is a German people, and they do speak a common German language, which was really kind of clarified by Martin Luther in the 1520s, 1521-22, when Martin Luther did his German New Testament. He kind of crafted or clarified or unified the Germanic languages into a German language, and there's a sense of being German, right? But there wasn't a Germany in the political sense until 1871. Same thing with Italy. There were Italians, an Italian language, and an Italian culture, and an Italian heritage, long before there was an Italian nation state. So what a nation state is it brings together people under one government, under a unified central authority. And then nationalism is simply referring to the ideology. It's an ism, right? And so like every ism, it's the ideology. And so nationalism is that nation states should be, right? Nation states should be. We should unite the people of common nationality under one nation state. Now this is, like I said several times, this is highly controversial because in a lot of places you don't have a concept of nationhood, or you have tribes, and there are multiple tribes who might speak the same language or similar languages, and then what's the defining line between a tribe and a nation? It's difficult. We're going to be, for the purposes of history here, we're going to be looking at 3 examples of modern nation states that were created all around the same time. Japan in 1868, Germany in 1871, and Italy really 1871 as well. Japan. So for 260 years, Japan was under what's known as the Tokugawa shogunate, or the age of the shogun, right? It began in 1600, and one of the things that began in 1600 with the establishment of the shogunate by Tokugawa, who's the guy who founded it, was the brutal suppression and expulsion of Christians and Christianity. So in 1600, Christians were coming, they were bringing Christianity, they were bringing the message about Jesus. There were about 300,000 Christians in Japan, many of whom were Jesuit Catholics, but there were others as well, and they were all outlawed and kicked out or forced underground. And really for hundreds of years, Christianity was not allowed in Japan, and Japan remains largely closed culturally to the gospel, even though Christianity is legally allowed. The emperor had very little to no power during the Tokugawa shogunate. The shoguns were the leaders of the country. So the political head of the country was not the emperor, but the shogun. But even though the shogun had a lot of prestige and was considered to be the leader, he had limited power because the daimyo, who were the local leaders, the local lords, they really held most of the power because they controlled the land. Okay, and in the age of the Act of Seclusion in 1636 was another one of these early decisions made under the Tokugawa shogunate that said, we're not going to have anything to do with the West. We don't want to be Christian. We don't want to be Western. We're kicking the West out. There was a small Dutch trading post at Nagasaki, and that was the only Western influence or Western trade allowed in Japan throughout the Tokugawa shogunate. And then you have peasants during this time. They were about 80% of the population, and they had no freedom. They had to farm the land. Now, there was about 20% of the population that did have freedom, and these people would become important because they are the merchants and the traders and the professional class, and they're actually going to be the leaders of the Meiji Restoration, the revolution that takes place in 1868. So the shoguns and the daimyos, they're a very small percentage of the population. They are the official rulers. They control the land. And so it's a top-down system. It's kind of feudal, right? You have a shogun at the top. He appoints daimyos, and daimyos rule over local areas, territories. And working their land are the peasants. So this system encapsulates about 80% of the population of Japan. But there is a 20% that live in the cities and in the ports and who engage in trade and commerce and craftsmanship. And these 20% actually, particularly toward the end of the Tokugawa shogunate during the 1800s, they are becoming wealthier. And as they are becoming wealthier, they are becoming more influential in the political scene. You see, agriculture is a fairly flat economic activity. You have land, you farm it, you produce crops, you sell the crops, you make a certain amount of money, and that's it. But if you can do trade, manufactured goods, you can actually grow your economic base. You can actually become wealthier more so than just having the same piece of land and continuing to work it year after year. So a crisis happened toward the end of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1854, and that is when Matthew Perry showed up in an American steamship and with American firepower on display, forced the Japanese to sign a trade agreement with America. Now, this was humiliating to Japan. Japan was a proud nation, but it was also eye-opening because they realized the rest of the world has steamships and cannons and rifles and a modern army and military. We have swords and, we're backward. They basically were forced to realize we're out of touch with the modern world. All of this isolation we've been pursuing for 250 years has left us completely out of touch with the modern world. We have no progress that will allow us to compete or even defend ourselves. We're helpless because we're backward. And so during this time, in 1868, so 14 years after Perry's visit, 1868, the young emperor was named MEIJI, but he was only about 14 years old. In his name, the merchants and traders, the new wealthy 20%, led a revolution that they called the Meiji Restoration. They said that they were restoring Meiji, the emperor, to his rightful status as head of Japan, and that Japan was going to have an emperor who was really an emperor again. That was kind of a cover story because really he was a 14-year-old kid, and really it was the merchants who were taking over, and they were just looking for a way to undermine the power structure of the shogun and the daimyo. So the shoguns were done away with immediately. It took a little bit of time for the daimyo system to be replaced by a bureaucratic system based upon merit and not based upon title and land. So they did see significant social, political, and economic change. They got rid of their feudal system. They adopted a cabinet system of government. They also became expansionists during this time, and they took Hokkaido. So if you look at the map of Japan, the island that's at the north, the sort of triangular-shaped island with the point at the top, that's Hokkaido. So they took that during the Meiji Restoration. By the way, there were lots and lots of Christians there. A lot of the Christians who had been kicked out had fled to Hokkaido, and so when they were brought in, there were lots of Christians, and they were kind of persecuted again. And then at the far southern tip of Japan is an island known as Okinawa, and you can kind of see it on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen and map. So Japan becomes a modern nation state, but it also becomes expansionist, which is another thing that tends to go along with nationalism. All right, let's switch to Italy. Italy becomes a modern nation state between the years 1860 and 1871. It really is a process that began all the way back in 1815. But we could spend a lot of time talking about this process, but essentially what happens is you have two key guys in the 1860s who really bring this together in the 1850s and 60s. It's Victor Emmanuel II in the north, and it's Giuseppe Garibaldi in the south. So if you look at the Italian city-states in 1858, the green, right? The green is Victor Emmanuel II, and the blue is Giuseppe Garibaldi. And essentially, they unify themselves with each other, and then they take over everything that's in the middle. And so by 1871, you have Italy as a nation state, Rome as its capital, and Victor Emmanuel II as its king. He's actually crowned King of Italy in 1861, the first king of a united Italy since the 6th century, since the 500s, which gives him, he has the title Father of the Fatherland, Padre della Patria, right? But Garibaldi was key to his success. He would not have become king of a unified Italy if it were not for Giuseppe Garibaldi, who basically unified all of southern Italy and then handed it over to Victor Emmanuel II in 1861. So that's how Italy, through a series of conflicts. Now, why was Italy pressed? Japan was pressed from the outside by Matthew Perry and the Americans showing up. Italy was pressed from the outside initially by Napoleon, who took over in the early 1800s, and then by Austro-Hungary, who was pressuring them in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. So it was some outside pressures that caused the Italians, too, to say, we need to unify, we need to become one people, because we are all Italians, and this French guy Napoleon, or these Austro-Hungarians, they're pressing in. And we need to unify so that we can be stronger and withstand this outside pressure. So nationalism is often driven by outside pressure. Germany. Germany followed a similar timeline to Italy. Really, they both, if you look it up, the process of unification for both countries is laid out as 1815 to 1871. 1815 is really the fall of Napoleon and the establishment of this peace after the fall of Napoleon. And that begins to get Germany and Italy thinking about, we need to be unified. But it takes a long time for them to get there. And they both get there by 1871. There's a huge power struggle in Germany for decades. It's difficult to get into. Lots of people in Austria speak German. And so there's this desire to have a larger Germany that would encompass all German-speaking people, including the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But there's other people, namely Prussia, who says, no, we just want Germany to be Germany. And that would leave Prussia in charge of basically everything. So long story short, Otto von Bismarck and the Prussians win. And Prussia becomes the dominant force in the new Germany. And the king of Prussia, Otto von Bismarck, becomes Chancellor of the German Empire in 1871. They're immediately in a conflict with France, which is also part of the pressure that causes them to unite, is to try to unite themselves to defend themselves against France in 1871 in what's called the Franco-Prussian War, which we will talk about when we talk about World War I in 20th century history. All right, so nationalism. So we're seeing some common themes here. People are often unified under pressure from outside groups. Japan was pressured by America. Napoleon and the Austro-Hungarian Empire threatened both Italy and Germany, and then Germany was further threatened by France. And so you have these outside pressures that cause people to realize, wait a minute, all of us within this certain territory here, we all speak the same language, we are all the same kind of people, we are us and they're them. Let's unify as the larger us, and that way we'll be stronger against the them that's threatening us. Thus, nationalism is kind of an expanded tribalism. It's a sense of we are the we, right? How does the American Constitution begin? We, the people of the United States of America. There's a we to it, right? We're Americans. And part of that, we speak English. We come from the British colonial tradition. That's what it was. The big question now is, what is it now, right? That's a huge question. So nationalism, however, when fully embraced, nationalism leads to empire building, and specifically a sense that the we is superior to the them. Not only that we need to protect ourselves against them, but that we are really better than them. So in some cases, this becomes explicit. Japan sees themselves as the center of the world and the center of the universe, and they see the Japanese people as being ethnically, culturally, racially superior to the rest of the world. I'm talking about the Meiji era Japan. And so there is a self-conscious, we should be unified because we are better than everyone else. And of course, we know Germany went down that path under Adolf Hitler. We Germans, we're not just German, and so we should unify, but we're better than everybody else, and so we should dominate everyone else. And there's that sense in America in some circles too. We're Americans, and that means we're the best. We're the best that ever was. And that means that we should dominate the rest of the world. Well, so nationalism is problematic because it's kind of an expanded tribalism, and it can often lead to racial superiority and to empire building. And we have to ask the question, we're talking about three countries, Italy, Germany, Japan. Where do they end up by 1940? By 1940, they are the Axis powers intent on taking over and dividing up the world. Japan is going to take Asia, Italy is going to take Africa, Germany is going to take Europe, and eventually they wanted to take the Americas as well. So these three nations that are born in 1868 and 1871 end up allying with each other and seeking to take over the world. There's another angle of questions we need to ask, and that has to do with our national identity as Americans. And the question really is a fundamental one, and that is America a nation state? And of course, politically and historically, everyone would say, of course, America is a nation state. We have a constitution, we elect a president, we have a Congress, we are one political entity. But are we one people nationally? We have the state part of it, because if you are a multinational state, then you're really an empire. Is America an empire? Well, that doesn't make us feel comfortable. We don't like to think about that. Maybe we're a multicultural nation state. That's really how we're classified, as a multicultural nation state, because people don't even identify themselves as Americans. Like, if you go to a Swede and you say, what are you? They'll say, I'm a Swede. If you go to a German and say, what are you? They'll say, I'm a German. If you go to an American and say, what are you? Say, well, I'm a German, Dutch, Irish American. I'm a African American. I'm an Asian American. I'm a Hispanic American. Because we don't feel comfortable just saying, I am an American, because there's a sense that being an American is not really a national identity in the cultural sense. Politically, yes, but culturally, do we have a common identity? If we're not an empire and we're not a culturally unified nation state, what are we? How do we identify ourselves? One of the things we're seeing in the Trump era is a great divide between Trump and the America First movement and the conservatives and the other side, right? The everybody is in and tear down the walls. And we watched the Oscars, a few nights ago, and it was all pushing the other side. It was like an anti-Trump rally, anti-America First, anti-cultural homogeny. But there are these two sides, right? We need to hear both sides as believers, and we need to understand both sides as believers, and we need to ask questions about what is America, and what might we anticipate for the future of America if we are not unified as a culture, and we are increasingly divided. Abraham Lincoln asked the question of, can a nation divided against itself stand? Because he was quoting Jesus, basically. House divided against itself cannot stand. So here we are. We're learning about nationalism. It does have an ugly side. Many people would say that soon after America became united as a sense of America, we became expansionistic and imperialistic. We took over part of Mexico in the Mexican-American War. We took over part of Spain in the Spanish-American War. We got our feet involved in Europe in World War I and World War II. We've been kind of a global superpower since. So many people would say we've gone from being a nation to an empire. I don't know if that's true entirely. There's certainly some truth to it that can't really be denied historically. But these are important questions for us to ask. And they might be the kind of question that I ask you to wrestle with in an essay question on a test. What is nationalism? What is a nation state? How did Japan, Italy, and Germany become nation states? Is America a nation state? What do you foresee for the future of America? These are all questions worth asking as we continue to study together. All right, that's the end of class for today. I will see you on Thursday.